Thank you very much, Hans-Georg. Thank you very much to CPTR to inviting me to deliver this talk on global health. Just a small correction to what was just being said is that I'm now at the Stop TB department at WHO and not at the Stop TB partnership anymore. So it's just to make it clear. So, well, I think it's good, and I really appreciate being invited to give the final talk of this session, because I think that when we speak about cross-sector perspective, it's extremely important to have the global health view. And I was extremely pleased to hear the presentation by Hans-Georg initially, and insisting not only on the regulatory aspect and how to address so many different problems at the same time, but also starting to look beyond licensure, what happens. And that's exactly where we at WHO are extremely concerned, because that's where the country asks us about recommendations, and that's where we are dealing in terms of global TB control, because we want to make sure that every new drug or new regimen that is coming off the market is, of course, being accessible to patients in the best possible way, and that it is done at considering all safety concerns being addressed properly. So, and I think that's excellent, because that gives now the right about the global health perspective. So, in order to address that, I will first review the TB burden, because I think it's always important to start from there, and then go and speak about the challenge in introducing new TB drug regimen in countries in common practice, how we are developing guidance to countries at WHO, and then speaking about this process as a pluri-partners model. And Chris Hansen asked me to finish with a type of slide on what could be the role of CPTR. So these are more questions about how to go forward. So I think this is, I mean, you will find that I always start my talk with this slide, but I think it's extremely important, because that's the situation, the global burden of TB. Still in 2010, the WHO Global TB Report on 2012, reporting data from last year, is being launched next week in Washington. So these are still the 2010 data. So 8.8 million estimated new TB cases in the world today, with 1.4 million of deaths. Very importantly, we still have a lot of TB cases associated with HIV, 1.1 million, so 13% of the new estimated TB cases. And this is important when we speak about drug to consider, because that has implication in terms of combination therapy, and with quite a high fatality rate of 350,000 estimated deaths per year. The second big issues in TB now is also MDR TB, with an estimated 440,000 new cases a year, and with a 30% case fatality rate, as can be seen. In terms of incidence rates, here is the global situation, and what we can see is that the highest burden of TB now is in Asia, with about 60% of the estimated 8.8 million cases, and the highest rate are still in Africa, mainly due to HIV infection. So the global number, the highest burden of case, can be seen in Southeast Asia and Western Pacific altogether. The impact of HIV on TB is the most important in Africa. 80% of the HIV-associated TB cases are in Africa, and it is important to remember that, and to remember that we have seen a huge increase of notification over the years since the HIV pandemic appeared. Now, MDR TB, one of the big concerns as well in terms of capacity to be able to treat this patient with a treatment which is long, toxic, difficult to handle, extremely expensive. And the percentage of MDR TB cases among new TB cases, which is getting high, and as you can see here, the countries where we have the highest rates of MDR TB. And here on the more absolute number, you can see that most of the MDR TB cases are being seen in the Asia and Eastern Europe regions. Okay, I'm afraid it's, okay. That's not the latest version which I gave, but I will handle that. Okay, and then in terms of XDR-TB, 84 countries in the world have now reported at least one XDR-TB case. So this is the situation we are dealing presently. In terms of global health, global aspects, There are global targets, and the targets are being fixed, set by the UN Millennium Development Goals and by the Stop TB Partnership. And then the targets were quite unambitious, and they were mainly to have halted by 2015 and begun to reverse the incidence of TB for the Millennium Development Goals, and for the Stop TB Partnership, a 50% reduction in TB incidence and prevalence and mortality by 2015 compared to 1990 levels. So where are we now? Briefly, in terms of incidence, then we've already reached the Millennium Development Goal. Good, because we have started seeing a reverse of the incidence of TB in 2002, which is now falling down at 1.4% a year. In terms of the Stop TB Partnership indicators, prevalence decreased to 50% of the 1990 level. We are nearing it, as long as we can see now with estimation, and we probably reach it in terms of reduction in mortality. So we are on stage for most of the global estimates. But, and this is the big but, and that's where we have to intervene, there are still problems, because we estimate 8.8 million new cases, but in fact only 5.8 are being reporting to us. So we still have a 30% gap. That means persons who are in the community with tuberculosis not being diagnosed. Another big but is that the treatment success of globally of tuberculosis is high, 87%, so we can be extremely happy and be victorious, but it's on SME positive only, that's one. And as you can see in terms of regions, you have regions like European region, which is even going worse over the time, mostly related to the problem of MDR TB. So still not a won battle. In terms of MDR TB, we have evidence from data reported to us that the MDR TB numbers are increasing. The notification of numbers reported to us is increasing, but what we can see is that only 1 in 5 is effectively put under treatment, which is really a big concern, and that's also have to be driving us in how we are thinking about drug and drug introduction in countries. What's about the time trends? And again, a big signal. We have countries like Estonia, where we can see on the left-hand side that the reported notification of cases of drug-susceptible and drug-resistant TB is decreasing over time. So this is under control, which is very good. It's reverting. We have the evidence of the Tomsk Oblast, Russia, where we can see that the MDR TB has been a problem, but is being under control, so which is good. But we have alarming data from Botswana, which shows that even though the number of TB cases remain steady, we have an increased number of reported MDR TB cases. So that's where we are. And that's, I think we always should remember that, because it's very good to think of new treatment, of new drugs and so, but we have to think on how then it has to be in practice to address this problem. So there are a lot of unmet needs in terms of treatment, and we all know that the treatment could be shortened, could be better for association with HIV antiretroviral therapy, could be better in terms of MDR TB treatment, and could be better also for latent TB infection. We have a global pipeline, which I'm not going to detail, this has been presented several times. But what is interesting is that as we are now looking at the development pathway, we have novel drugs and shorter treatments with new or repurposed drugs, which are going along the clinical pathway, proceeding along the clinical development pathway, and some are getting soon potentially approved by regulatory authority for treatment, for instance, of drug-resistant TB, because we have evidence that 2 new drugs are being submitted for licensure. So what does it tell us? It has implications for TB control programs. The first is that if one speaks about a drug being introduced, then we have to think about regimen. Again, for the same reason as being said by Hans-Georg earlier, TB treatment is based on regimen. So if there is a new drug being approved, then we have to know and better which optimal combination has to be recommended with that drug, either for drug-susceptible or drug-resistant TB and under programmatic conditions. We have to evaluate the requirements in terms of patients' eligibility for the new drugs. What does it require concerning the potential adverse effect or potential aspects, like maybe looking at electrocardiogram or glycemia testing or this type of things before patients can be put under treatment. We have to assess the programmatic feasibility of these new regimens with the new drugs, and then of course have to evaluate the cost effectiveness, because if the new drug added to a very expensive regimen, like for instance MDR-TB treatment is estimated to be about $1,500 at better for the full treatment, then if we had another $1,000 on that, that might also be constraining accessibility, especially in the poorest country. We have to assess the cost effectiveness, and then we have, and that's important, as mentioned by Hans-Georg, we have to look about the proper surveillance. That means once treatment are being delivered to patients and being marketed in countries, we have to make sure that there is a proper surveillance in terms of safety, in terms of monitoring of treatment outcome, and a good pharmacovigilance system in place. And then, lastly, and this is, I think, extremely important, is that we have to make all the balls in our court in order to make sure that there is a responsible use of the drug. And this is absolutely key. We need to make sure, and that's a work that can be made by regulators, but as Hans-Georg said, regulators don't regulate clinical practice, so we have to speak with the governments in order to make sure that there is a system in place so that drugs, new regimens are being properly used in terms of appropriate indication, appropriate doses, appropriate drug combinations, appropriate treatment duration, that there is no off-label use of the new drugs, which can be absolutely detrimental both to the patients and to the capacity of the drug to retain its efficacy. So with this in mind, we have to think of WHO as an organization that develops guidance to the world, guidance to countries. And guidance means what we think should be the best way to address a certain condition and manage this condition, treat, and then on this basis, countries are developing their own policies and adapt the recommendation. So we brought that to the knowledge of our strategic and technical advisory group, STAC-TB, which is evaluating what the STOP-TB department is doing at WHO. And STAC-TB recommended us, and I think that's important to read all these points, because it says clearly that we have, as WHO, to issue clear policies to guide countries on the introduction of new regimens for treatment of drug-susceptible and drug-resistant TB, upon availability of evidence in support of regimens, drug and regimen. We have to issue specific requirements on what evidence and information would be needed. So that's important. We can only establish guidelines on evidence, and we need to say now, and I will come back on that later, which type of evidence we'd like to see. We are not at all a drug regulatory authority. We don't have anything to see with that, but we are recommending for the world. Therefore, we need to have the best evidence on which we can make the recommendation. Therefore, we need to promote collaboration and action with partners so that there is appropriate use of regimens for treatment of all forms of TB and avoid irrational use of new drugs. And then WHO should organize expert consultation to review the evidence of new drugs as they are coming up, so that we can develop a treatment policy guidance to national health authorities, governments. So, that's where, I'm sorry, there was another slideshow which was most recent, because I was presenting the system by which we are working at WHO, so I will just comment it verbally very briefly so that you understand how it works, is that we have a system called the Guideline Review Committee. So WHO develops guidelines, and for that we have a Guideline Review Committee at WHO, which is revising how we are doing. And it's very important, and it's a staged process, and it's long. And it requests to have a plan on how we are going to address and develop the new guidelines, but we have to state exactly the evidence that we are going to assess, which data we have, which evidence we have. And then we have to state exactly how this evidence is going to be assessed by external groups, by external independent advisors, with a very, very thorough commitment in terms of conflict of interest, declaration of interest, so that we can make sure that there is no bias or no perceived impression of favoring one product versus the other one. So all that takes time, and that was the slide that is missing, showing all the various degrees, and it's long, it takes time, and that's how we can do it for reviewing the guidelines. So because of that, we'll be in a situation here, the guidelines for the treatment of tuberculosis were revised in 2009, and then we usually give a lapse time of 4 to 5 years before revision. The guidelines for the treatment of MDR-TB were being revised in 2011, and here again, if we give a lapse time of 3 to 5 years, it's still some time. Now, every guidelines has very clearly indicated that upon new evidence occurring, being brought to the public knowledge, then we might go to revision of the guidelines earlier than the due date. But are we going to go to a revision of the guidelines of the MDR-TB once we know, for instance, that the bedaquiline will be approved on the market in the United States, knowing that delamanid might be approved by EMEA later? So maybe it's not wise for us to just decide on a revision of guidelines just based on one drug, because we know there will be a series of drugs. So we have to think on what could be the process. And for that, we thought we need to have a process in place so that every time a new drug or a new regimen is going along the pathway that we have seen with the guideline, with the pipeline, then we can react. That means reacting means stating to countries what could be done, without having to say, okay, wait, we've got to get a 6 months delay in order to have our guidelines revision, which will be long and won't be accepted very easily by countries because they will see that things are changing and they would like to this change to benefit the patients. So we have to set up a system by which we can be reactive, make the best available recommendation to countries, and yet keep the evidence so that we can revise appropriately the guidelines. So this is with all that in mind, and sorry if I've been a bit long on that we have to set up a task force that we have pompously, named Task Force for New TB Drug Policy Development. And the task force are a group of experts that advise us on the process. How should we do? So with this task force is developing a strategic plan so that we can develop the policy guidance development. And then we set up a policy development framework that will be used for any type of product going out of the pipeline towards registration licensure, either as a drug or as a regimen. The strategy plan has been set up by the task force, and I think it's important to look at the principles, the introduction of new drugs, and again, I'm coming back to the presentation by Hans-Georg, which was absolutely brilliant, I think, showing the multi-stage aspect, the multi-stage process. The development of appropriate combination of drugs is efficient coordination and sharing of data between key partners, because if we are speaking about a new drug, then who is going to look at the best combination, the optimal combination for the use of that drugs? And if the company doesn't do that, who should be doing that? Introduction of new TB drugs should be adaptable to country settings, so we have also to envisage that, different epidemics background, and the health infrastructure, and also, of course, the level of preparedness in terms of diagnosis of drug resistance, and then surveillance of drug resistance. There is a need for rapid approval. We should be reactive of new TB drugs, and when it is being approved by regulatory authorities in high-burden country. And then we must ensure that there is equitable access to new drugs for all patients in need worldwide, and that we should be linked with measures to prevent the misuse of the drug. So here we think that WHO has a key role to play for the development of policy recommendation for the rational introduction of drugs and regimens in programmatic settings, and we must ensure that there is proper, equitable, and cost-effectiveness access to treatment. So this is what is driving us, and the strategy plan has a series of content. I'm not going to go into the detail as time is passing, but what is important is that we are producing some documents, and what is important, and again, considering this multi-stage aspect, considering the needs absolutely to involve as much as possible all key stakeholders, we have started thinking of informing whichever group of partners and holders we think are the most important. So we have designed an information note to the countries, information note to the drug or regimen developers, and to regulators, in which we say what we are going to do as WHO so that we can make the best recommendation to countries for the use of new drug or regimen for treatment of TB. Which type of data we would like to see so that we can assess them and then base our recommendations on true and uncontroversial evidence. So this is the note to drug regimen developers. A note to regulators about highlighting the multiple hurdles that have been brought to our attention by various drug companies, how they face that and what could be the constraints in terms of introduction of the drugs, and started to speak with regulators about way of sharing data, way of having mutual recognitions or shared review, exploring. So this is also something that we are exploring here. And then speaking to countries, telling what we are doing to countries so that they know, and especially for the later stage, which is about the operationalization of the new drugs and regimens, because we want to work with countries on this operationalization of drugs. So we have these notes, which we have been working on. We've been sharing with as many persons as possible so that we can have a buy-in by the various stakeholders, and we'll publish those. We developed the policy development framework that describes the process, the whole process which I've been telling you about, and that will be used to guide the development of policy recommendation. Again, based on progress of new drugs or drug combinations along the clinical development pathway with all this type of various data, PK, drug interaction study, phase 2 trial, phase 3 pivotal trials, based on the fact that stringent, so-called stringent regulatory authorities would have been giving an approval for licensor. Based on that, how we are going to react as WHO so that we can make the best recommendations. So that this evidence will be used by expert committees that will be convened by WHO to update or revise the policy recommendations as needed. So we'll be planning expert consultation so that we can assess the evidence based on the various drug regimen that are going along the pipeline development. And we are in the process already, and that's the submission we are doing to the guideline review committee. We set up the system, the process, so that they know, and we are in the process of selecting these experts and setting up the timeline. Very briefly, we have to think about market introduction, and here it's important that we start mapping out the detailed expertise needed in terms of pricing, funding, the public versus private issues, and identify the appropriate stakeholders. I give some examples, again, who can be working with us to make sure that there is a cost-effective introduction of drugs into countries. Evaluate the market shortcomings and the community access issue so that we can identify the obstacles. And more down the line, the introduction to countries, and that's the work we are doing, or we would like to do with countries, which is to work with them on the background epidemiological data. They need to know your epidemics for country preparedness, what is the situation in terms of health, laboratory, clinical infrastructure, the control program infrastructure, and then get and try the country support so that we can get access to new drugs. And here are a series of criteria. But most important is that we would like to develop demonstration sites for initial deployment of new drugs with harmonized methods and surveillance. And this is also something that we are discussing with countries and with donors. So, as I say, a pluripartners model. Why? Because we need a dialogue with everybody, and that's why I think CPTR is a fantastic forum, because we can have access to drug regimen developers, to sponsors, to regulators, to national TB program managers, and they have to be put all together around the table so that we can better act in terms of introduction. The information notes, as I say, have been circulated to get a buy-in, and we make it public in October, December 2012. We are setting up a series of meetings. We are, with the help of CPTR, Global Regulatory Pathway Working Group, working on a satellite meeting that we organize in the margins of the International Conference of Drug Regulatory Authorities in Tallinn in October 2012. We organize a meeting at Kuala Lumpur. So, a role for CPTR, just to finish at the last slide, has been requested to me. I think CPTR has a unique forum, grouping representatives from key drug development initiatives, and therefore has a critical role to play in the dialogue with the key stakeholders. And I think here, that's where we value very much the forum that CPTR is creating. CPTR can contribute extremely effectively, and I give here two examples of working groups with which we at WHO have been extremely closely working, the Global Regulatory Pathway Working Group and the Access and Appropriate Use Working Group, in order to address the issue of compassionate use, which have been over very rapidly, but I'm happy to discuss more this afternoon in the group, and then the issue about regulatory aspects. Now, contribute to works of the task force. That's where I think CPTR would be very welcome. Contribute to what we are doing at the task force as a technical resource. And then the later stage are being open for discussion, but definitely there will be opportunity for doing more work together. So I would like to, as an acknowledgement, acknowledge the task force members who've been helping us developing this strategy plan, WHO staff who's been contributing to the whole project, and then Bill Gates Foundation, USAID, and the FID who are contributing to funding. And I thank you for your attention.